Hi, my good friends. I hope you're doing well today. Thank you so much for stopping by. Now, in Lexington, Kentucky, back in 1965, 39-year-old Mary Morris Kawine and was found murdered in her upstairs bedroom. You might hear the name Kawine pronounced several different ways, but I've always heard it pronounced the way I'm saying it, Kawine. So I want to roll with that today. She was called Mary Morris, kind of like you would say Mary Ellen or Mary Ann. It was July 5th of that year. Mary Morris and her husband, Dr. Madison K. Wine III, who you might remember from our episode called The Blue Fugates of Troublesome Creek, had attended an Independence Day party with their neighbors, Sam and Betty's brother. Now, later on the next day, Betty dropped by to check on her good friend Mary Morris, he found her sitting in a chair in the bedroom with her head slumped over to one side. She was indeed deceased and still wearing the pretty yellow dress with the black flowers on it that she had worn at the party the night before. Now, an autopsy would confirm that she'd sure enough been murdered. So, have you sit down, grab your drink, and let me tell you what happened as best as anybody knows. Dr. Madison K. Wine and his wife Mary Morris. Now, Dr. Madison K. Wine and his wife Mary Morris were part of the big uptown social circle in Lexington. They both came from well-known and well-respected families. Dr. Madison was named after his grandfather, who was a great Kentucky poet known as the Keats of Kentucky, and you can see him right there. Madison's father, Preston, even changed his name to Madison K. Wine II to honor the legacy of his dad, who was so beloved by President Theodore Roosevelt that he quoted his poems about the beauty of nature. And Mary Morris' father, George Swinebroad, was a renowned thoroughbred auctioneer, and you can see him there. Now, if you hadn't never seen one of them dudes go at it, you ain't never seen an auction. George rattled off a sale with 9 of them year-old colts that went on to win the Kentucky Derby. And that's the way you build yourself a reputation in Lexington, Kentucky, which is known as the thoroughbred capital of the world. Now, if you drive through Lexington, you'll see fences that don't have any corners. Now, when I asked about that, and I don't remember who it was that I asked now, they told me that the horses would run so fast along the fence that if it weren't round, they'd actually crash into it and hurt themselves. But anyway, Madison III was an Army medic in the war, and during World War II, that is. Now, when he got home, he met Mary Morris Swinebroad. I don't know why I have trouble saying that word. Swinebroad at the University of Kentucky, where he was a graduate assistant in animal pathology, which Mary Morris just happened to be studying too. Now, that's where they met. Now, in 1949, the two got married, with Mary Morris giving up her career to support Madison in his quest to get his MD at Tulane University in 1954, and that would be him. Now, by the late 1950s, Madison had been doing whatever doctors called their final training at the Mayo Clinic, and it was ready to head back to Kentucky. And Dr. Madison and Mary Morris, along with their 2 youngins, Madison IV, and of course, and Betsy, all hauled it back home to Lexington. In 1960, Dr. K. Wine became associate professor of the University of Kentucky School of Medicine and was on staff at the University Medical Center, specializing in hematology, which is the study of blood, as we all know. You can say that I guess he was all about the blood and was passionate about his work. Now, he decided to specialize in it, he said, because the blood cells always look beautiful to him. Now, I can say that they will get your attention when you're looking at them under a microscope, but I wouldn't go so far as to call them beautiful. But that passion and drive helped him solve the mystery of the blue fugates of Troublesome Creek back in the early 1960s. And there's a picture just to show that they really do exist, or did exist. It's a big legend in the Appalachian Mountains that they actually ever existed. But that feat got him a whole lot of attention and respect in the medical field, and I reckon that all ended as a tenure in the university for the good Dr. Madison. Now, by July 4th of 1965, Dr. Madison and Mary Morris had been married for about 15 years, and they were living the life and success that brought them, and that would be Mary Morris. Now, they had a big house in Lexington, and one of their favorite things to do was socializing with their neighbors Sam and Betty Strother. Now, back in then, the newspapers had what they called the social papers, and in Lexington, those pages would report on the two couples doing whatever they were doing at the time. I reckon people lived high life through their minds while they read about people who actually lived the high life in person, or something like that. Not sure, but whatever it was, sold a passel of newspapers, so they kept doing it. They were pretty good friends, so by the evening of July 4th of 1965, the K-Wine's 14-year-old son, Madison IV, well, he spent the night with friends at a lake house, and Mary Marr's usual babysitter was unavailable, so she called a friend named Phoebe Edwards to watch 9-year-old Betsy along with Struthers' children. And the Struthers swung by, picked up the K-Wines around 6 o'clock that evening, and went over to Lexington's Idle Hour Country Club for the big 4th of July blowout. And you might say that they did just that. They blew it on out. They spent the equivalent of about $400 in today's money on some high-octane drinks. Folks saw them have about 10 drinks apiece before they staggered out the front door of the club around 11:30. If I had to guess, they were down in that good Kentucky bourbon, which equals a granddaddy of a hangover the next day. Of course, 10 shots of anything would probably give you a pretty decent one, but you talk about a granddaddy when you talk about the bourbon of Kentucky. All of that would make the rundown of what happened next slightly less than a blackout, and in fact, the drinking just kept going once they got back to the Struthers' house, and around midnight didn't help either. It didn't help them remember anything, put it that way. It was during round 2 of the drink fest that Mary Marr said that she wasn't feeling too good and wanted to go on home. And with it being 1965 and all, back when drunk driving was probably about a pastime more than it was anything else, Sam, who might have been the only one standing at that point, drove Mary Marrs to the 3 blocks home and, of course, went in for a nightcap. Gotta have one for the road, they used to say. Yes, really, they did. I witnessed it firsthand. After they got inside, Sam called a cab for Phoebe and the babysitter, and around 12:30 in the morning, Phoebe would later say that she saw Mary Marrs just before she left, and she looked fine. Didn't even look a bit drunk as Phoebe left the house about 10 minutes after 1 o'clock in the morning. Now, of course, Sam was finishing his nightcap, which was a beer, and looking for another, and Mary Marrs must have started feeling much better because she was poured herself a bourbon and branch. And now that's Appalachian for bourbon and water. Now, the two were upstairs in the master bedroom because it was Kentucky hot, and the bedroom was the only room that had air conditioning. And that's the scene as Phoebe left. According to Sam Strother, as if he could remember most of anything at that point, Mary Marrs sat down in her armchair in the bedroom as they continued to drink and talk for about maybe 20 minutes. Sam said that when he left, Mary Marrs was sitting in her chair and was still sipping on her bourbon. Now, when Sam made it home, I guess we should be asking how Sam made it home, but I digress. But when he got there, he found Dr. K-Wine had probably overfilled his nightcap too and decided to stay over at the Struthers' place. I imagine that was because neither one of them were able to crawl out to the car and get behind the wheel. Sam dragged the good doctor into the family room and poured him into bed there. It's like a fold-out couch type thing he'd sleep on. Now, believe it or not, that was pretty normal for these two couples. They spent a lot of time together, and it always ended up with somebody dragging somebody off to sleep and just pass out and sleep it all off. Betty was the first one to rise, about halfway shine, I guess. After all that drinking, I don't know how the woman could see straight, let alone get up and walk. And knowing that Mary Marrs wasn't feeling too good the night before, Betty called to check on her and the kids. One of the kids answered the phone and told Betty that Mary Marrs hadn't come out of her room yet and the door was still shut. Betty thought the kids hadn't had breakfast yet and told them to not wake Mary Marrs up. Then she woke Sam up from his coma and sent him over to the K-Wine house. He drove up, honked the horn, the kids bailed out of the car and ran out of the house and ran into the car, and then they all went over to the Struthers' house for breakfast. Dr. Madison was still stretched out, cold as a wet mackerel, when Betty left to take the kids to swimming lessons at the pool. After the swimming, and then went on her way home, she decided that she was going to stop and check on Mary Mars. And when she got there, she did what she always did. Since they were all like family, she walked in. What she expected to see was Mary Mars with a Widowmaker hangover, cracking jokes about drinking too much last night. Instead, she found the house as quiet as a mausoleum. She started hollering out for Mary Mars, but got no response, so she continued on up the steps of the master bedroom. That's where she found her best friend, still wearing her pretty yellow dress and still sitting in the chair in the bedroom. Betty touched her, and she was cold and lifeless. Betty said that she looked so peaceful that it took her a bit to realize that Mary Mars was actually dead. Betty, probably because she was in full panic mode by then, called her husband and told him to get Madison home now. Sam walked into the house and with Dr. Madison, and they headed to the master bedroom once they got there. Now, Dr. Madison walked over to the nightstand beside the chair where Mary Mars was sitting, because even with his brain as fried as it was from alcohol, he was still the smartest man in the room. Now, he grabbed an empty beer can and a bourbon glass with a bit of bourbon still in it from where Mary Mars had been drinking, and handed it to Sam and told him to make it go away. Now, as if that wasn't suspicious at all, then, still not calling police, Dr. Madison called a family friend who lived nearby, but when he didn't get an answer, he called Dr. William Winternitz. I have trouble with these names, ain't I? But Winternitz, who worked with him at the medical center. The doctor came over and pronounced Mary Mars Caewine dead at about 10:30 in the morning. Dr. Winternitz told police, yes, they were finally notified, that he saw a small drop of blood on Mary Mars' slip, which led him to further examine her body. He found 2 needle marks, one on each of Mary Mars' thighs. Now, the doctor looked around her body and the chair in the room expecting to find a hypodermic somewhere, but there just wasn't one. At least not out in the open, but when he poked around looking for a bourbon glass, because Sam told him that Mary Mars had been drinking her bourbon when he last saw her, but he couldn't find a glass in the room either. Then he looked around for a goodbye cruel world note, because Dr. Madison kept saying over and over again about that Mary Mars must have taken her own life. Of course, there was no note either. Now, Dr. Winternitz was the one who notified police of Mary Mars' passing at about 11:30 that morning. When he spilled his guts about all the initial findings, everything was in place, and the bed was still neatly made with no creases or any kind of anything, and which would indicate Mary Mars never slept in it and probably never moved from the chair after Sam left the room. Dr. Madison kept going on and to the police that Mary Mars had done away with herself, so they asked for permission to perform an autopsy, and he agreed. The autopsy took place on July 7th, and the coroner ruled Mary Mars' death wasn't a natural one, and she hadn't done it to herself. She died of what's called carbolic acid poisoning, sometime between 2 and 6 a.m. Carbolic acid was an antiseptic used in the medical field and generally sterilized, and it cleaned wounds and sterilized the surfaces and everything for surgery. It even worked on the instruments and like I said, wounds if it was needed there too, just as a topical anesthetic. But if it's ingested, it's lethal. During the autopsy, the doctor found one puncture wound on the lower outside of Mary Mars' right thigh and another one on the outer left of the thigh. She was injected with something, but the pathologist was unable to confirm what it was that was injected into her system. Now, the doctor also found that what was expected, Mary Mars was high on an intoxication meter, and her blood alcohol level was about 0.4. Folks, that's a dang near death from alcohol poisoning too. That left Dr. Madison walking around questioning the ability of the pathologist at the University of Kentucky Medical Center, who were the ones that performed the autopsy. He absolutely insisted that Mary Mars had taken her own life and demanded that another doctor go back and review the autopsy. All the hubbub and arguing over the autopsy, together with it getting out that Mary Mars might have been murdered, shocked the whole town of Lexington. People already read about her death notice, and asked that all memorials be sent to the American Cancer Society, so they thought it must have been cancer that took her out, not a murderer. And on July 8th, Mary Marr's funeral service was held in Lexington's Episcopal Church. After her burial, Coroner Chester Hager notified police that it was going to be a coroner's case. That meant that there was going to be a coroner's inquest because he smelled a rat somewhere in the mix. Now, police dragged Dr. Madison back in for some questions, and he just kept saying that her death was not a murder. She must have did it to herself. Just to be sure, the coroner held a big review of all his findings. Now, while everybody's waiting on the official review of Mary Marr's autopsy, and while they was waiting, Dr. Madison, who probably ate at Burger King because he was determined to have things his way, called Mary Marr's parents on July 10th to drop some knowledge on them that he'd met with the pathologist who reviewed her autopsy, and they agreed that she'd took way on too many Alka-Seltzers that caused gas to build up in her system and led to a heart attack, which took her out. That went directly against the official autopsy findings, of course, and which still listed her death as unnatural. That meant not by her own hand. It said that her death was definitely a result of acute gastritis due to ingestion of carbolic acid. Folks, that would be a slow and horrible, painful half an hour or so of being drawed plumb double just about in pain before you passed on. Now, the only questions the coroner had left was where and when and who administered the poison. You don't need to use but just a small dose to kill somebody. In small doses, the victim becomes violently ill, lapses into a coma, and dies. Now, if you drink it, your mouth and throat would probably feel like they were on fire and would probably taste it because it's very bitter. But that bitter taste and smell is masked when it's mixed with alcohol. In Mary Marr's case, the coroner thought that it was pretty likely that she'd been dosed at the country club, which may be why she mentioned not feeling well and heading home before Dr. Madison got home that night. Now, the symptoms of the poison would be the same as the symptoms of having a few many drinks. Now, if she was dosed while she was getting her drink on, nobody'd notice anything because they'd think that she was just a little swivel-legged from the bourbon. Now, detectives figured that way of often somebody showed some pretty high level of intelligence and attention to detail. In other words, I took that to mean that they meant it was probably a doctor. Since there was no evidence of burning in Mary Marr's mouth or esophagus, which they were sure would happen if carbolic acid hadn't been diluted with something, or maybe like bourbon and branch, they thought that they were on the right track, probably. Now, the only problem was that due to the amount of alcohol in her system, there was no way to determine when the poison was administered or the size of dose she had even got. That, along with everybody still being about half lit from the night before and unable to remember a whole lot, threw a curveball into the whole investigation of who killed Mary Marr's K-Wine and why they did it. She was loved by nearly everybody she ever met and very respected by her friends and family. That being except maybe one. The more police spoke with Dr. Madison, the more he adjusted his story just a scotch. Now, it could be that the night was coming back in little bits and pieces to him, or he was trying to hide something. Then the more they looked into the K-Wine's marriage, it started looking like it wasn't quite as smooth and lovey-dovey as the Lexington Society papers made it out to be. Now, Dr. Madison wasn't particularly all about his wife at all. From what I found, it looks to me like he thought of her as intellectually inferior and what he thought was a striking intellect for himself. Now, on top of that, she wasn't the only woman that he'd started up with and then slung to the curb. As a matter of fact, the collateral damage from Dr. Madison's affairs was more tangled up than a barrel of fish hooks with fishing line still on them. At first, Mary Marr's father told police that the K-Wine's marriage was a pretty happy affair for everybody involved. But his song started changing tune when he said that he knew Dr. Madison had had an affair with a colleague over the past year, so in fact, that Dr. Madison had been cheating on Mary Marr from what I could find, about as long as they'd been together, and from all indications, she knew about most of it. Now, police knew that because she'd talked it over with family. She said that Dr. Madison's latest love interest was a married woman who was one of his patients. Mary Mars said that she knew it wasn't the first time that he did the old friggy-diggy with somebody else, and to top it off, Dr. Madison wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. Now, he'd already asked for a divorce, but neither of them ever filed any paperwork to get it done. Dr. Madison's first officially recognized affair was with Dr. Emma Lappet. She was another hematologist. She was 39 years old too, divorced, and worked with him at the medical center. But by all accounts of folks at the center, they ended up with their fling around the fall of 1964. Dr. Emma didn't really want it to happen, though. It ended because Dr. Madison couldn't keep it in his britches and was already in another full-blown relationship with a woman named Barbara Lietman. She was the patient he was treating for Hodgkin's lymphoma. Of course, Dr. Madison kept it all close, and Barbara was a wife of another one of his colleagues named Dr. Herschel Lietman. Once the police got hold of that, they dragged the good doctor back downtown to ask him a few more questions about his relationships. Dr. Madison didn't bat an eye at the questions. He confirmed he'd been with other women and told investigators his relationship with Barbara Lietman had only been going on for a few weeks, and he pointed out that he was in love with Barbara. Sounds to me like he's more in love with Dr. Madison than anybody else or anything else. But then the horn dog said that the relationship had ended when Mary Mars died. That's when he found out that Mary Mars knew about Barbara because Mary Mars' grandmother had gave him a good reaming over it. Now, he said that Granny Swinebroad told him that Mary Mars thought that Dr. Lietman would pounce on Dr. Madison and erase him from the gene pool if he ever found out about the affair with his wife. She was afraid that if that did happen, that the highly respected Dr. Madison Cawein, the one who'd done all the groundbreaking scientific work, would be dragged before the medical board and relieved of his medical license, and in the event that he wasn't killed, then the family would lose everything they had. Of course, his claim that he and Barbara had called it off was a barefaced lie, like always, the rest of them. And then police knew that because Barbara told them herself. She said that she met Dr. Madison and asked if Mary Mars had been suicidal. And when he told her that Mary Mars wasn't a suicidal type, that along with a few other things, that Barbara decided that she'd best be talking to police. She was afraid that some unfortunate incident might befall her next, I assume. Who would blame her, I guess, with Mary Mars being dead and her lover's last mistress threatening to drag her out in the parking lot and put a good old-fashioned curb stomp on her? Well, if she didn't stay away from Dr. Madison. Yeah, that's right. Dr. Emma had never stopped loving Dr. Madison, and when he threw her to the curb for Barbara, she got a pretty decent case of the red ass. Now, she started following Dr. Madison home, driving by his house and the Lietman house too, just to see if the two lovebirds were together. It wasn't long after that Barbara's maid said that the phone call started. The caller asked about Barbara's schedule and where she'd been all day. Dr. Emma told the department secretary to never put any calls through from Barbara Lietman, and then she arranged a meeting with Dr. Herschel Lietman, in which she pretty much called his wife a skank because she was having an affair with one of her colleagues. Now, the straw that swayed the mule's back was when Barbara's maid answered the phone and heard that some old irritating voice again, and saying something like, "Tell Ms. Lietman she better watch the company she keeps and be careful who she's seen with because her life might just depend on it." That finally got Barbara downtown to do some talking. Now, while she was singing like Beverly Sills at Carnegie Hall, police were still poking around other leads. They found out that on the day Mary Mars was found, Dr. Lietman was at the medical center when he got a call from an operator around 2:30 in the morning telling him that his wife had called and he was needed at home right freaking now. He knew that it was about as odd as it gets because Barbara never called him at work unless maybe the house was on fire. First thing, he thought was that somebody was trying to sucker him into walking in on his wife with her lover. Yes, he had his suspicions too after his talk with Dr. Emma. This was worse than General Hospital, folks. I tell you it was. So Dr. Leitman didn't go home. He took off and went to the police and asked them what in the world they'd advise him to do in that situation. Sure enough, the police thought enough of it to fill out a report, which was dated July 5th, 1965. Now, the report said Dr. Leitman appeared nervous and seemed to be under a good bit of mental stress and was quite disturbed. It went on to say that the good doctor didn't seem that tore up over the affair because he'd already met with the lawyer who told him not to pounce on and half kill Dr. Madison, just to keep getting as much evidence as he could for a big knockdown, drag-out court battle. Dr. Leitman then told the officer taking the report that he honestly just felt like going and breaking Dr. Madison in two and killing him outright. Dr. Leitman was so mad that while leaving the police station, he sideswiped the police car on his way back to the hospital for his 6 a.m. rounds. Now, wouldn't you like to have been one of his patients that morning? There wasn't any doubt that Dr. Madison and all of his aftermath left a good number of folks with motive to hurt him or his family too. Once Barbara Leitman went to talking to police, and she didn't hide her affair with Dr. Madison. In fact, she talked like she might have been a little bit proud of it. She even told him that she had been pregnant and had the pregnancy terminated not long before the murder. But she never made it clear as if baby was Dr. Madison's or Dr. Leitman. The way police saw it, there was 3 people in Mary Marr's life that may have had something to gain if she went to pushing up daisies. Now, they would be Dr. Madison, her 3 and probably 4-timing husband. Then there was Dr. Emma, the lunatic Lappets, and as well as Dr. Herschel Leitman, who was about fed up with all of them. Now, normally, with a gaggle of suspicious nutballs like that, there's one of them will usually stick out as an obvious killer based on the method they used to get the job done, but this time, every blame one of them was well-versed in medicine and knew exactly how to administer carbolic acid in a diluted manner that would make their victim look like she had a tank full instead of being outright poisoned. Dr. Madison didn't have a history of violence and hadn't made threatening statements, but his actions and constant changes in his story made him suspicious as a $3 bill. Now, after all, the first thing Dr. Madison did was have Sam Strother take Mary Marr's bourbon glass and empty the beer can and dump them and don't say anything about them. Now, just to turn around and tell police that there hadn't been no glass or empty beer can on the table next to his wife when her body was found. Of course, that story changed too when police got Red with him, and he said that he told Sam to dispose of them, but just didn't have any reason as to why he did it. Another thing that he made sure that he told police on the day they found his wife was how he was a doctor. Be sure and tell them that up front, make him the smartest man in the room, I suppose. Now, he said that he never allowed medicine or hazardous materials into the house. That way he could make sure that his children stayed safe. But the doctor who pronounced Mary Marr dead and reported her death to police said that there were medications in the bedroom, and the police report and photos from the crime scene show medication all over the Kay Wine house like candy bowls at a party. Then there was those injection sites on Mary Marr's body. When they asked Dr. Madison if he kept syringes in the house, he said no. But the official police report says that there was a syringe found in the bedside table drawer in the master bedroom and had Dr. Kay Wine's fingerprints, one end of it to the other. Now, I reckon he didn't think they'd look around after he told them that there wasn't nothing to find, him being a doctor and all. Most narcissists expect that when they speak, B.F. Hutton listens. Now, Dr. Kay Wine told police over and over that he had no idea how the syringe ended up in the house and said that it had to have been planted by somebody that wanted to frame him for his wife's murder. Well, now I wonder who that might be. Dr. Leitman or Dr. Emma. Dr. Madison was sure enough suspicious, but to police, the most suspicious of them all was Dr. Emma. Her nutball activity had Dr. Madison and Barbara Leitman about half worried about the safety of everybody around them right before Mary Marrs died. Now, by September of 1965, while everybody was waiting on the coroner's inquest to wrap up, Barbara Leitman was still being treated by Dr. Madison for a lymphoma. She made an appointment with a neurosurgeon at the medical center to rule out any other illnesses before her next round of treatment come down the pike. Now, when the results were sent to Dr. Madison's office, back then they had the U.S. mail or a private courier to run actual paper reports all over the place. Somebody making a good living delivering these things. I know, I've seen it happen. They were snagged when they arrived by Dr. Emma, who called the neurosurgeon's office and told them that she was going to be taking over treatment on Barbara Leitman because they found out that her lymphoma was growing like a weed. Dr. Emma turned and ordered that Barbara Leitman be treated with a drug called nitrogen mustard. It was used as a chemotherapy treatment for some lymphoma patients. Now, from what I read, and people being treated with that would be like using a blowtorch to get a nice haircut. And the stuff was originally designed to be used in chemical warfare, basically. Luckily, Barbara knew it was powerful and classified as a Schedule I substance, so she refused the treatment, saying that she would only proceed if Dr. Madison told her it was her best treatment. Now, when Dr. Madison found out about it, with Dr. Emma's treatment plan, his head about exploded. He told Barbara that Dr. Emma must have misread tests or misunderstood something, and she made a mistake in ordering such a dangerous treatment, which could have killed her. Yeah, misread tests. That's it. That just tells me that Dr. Emma was willing to do whatever it took just to have things her way. At that point, police had to wonder if Dr. Emma could have killed Mary Mars to try to get even with, or maybe even get Dr. Madison back. The whole situation was an outright mess with plenty of suspects, and there was never an arrest made, folks. A grand jury would meet in late September 1965 with 14 witnesses testifying, including Dr. Emma, Dr. Madison, Madison K. Wine IV, the babysitter Phoebe Edwards, and the K. Wine's neighbor and friends, Sam and Betty Struther, Dr. Herschel Leitman, and the manager of the country club. Barbara Leitman was also subpoenaed, but wasn't able to appear due to her chemotherapy treatments. Now, by the end of it all, there were no indictments handed down. Over the course of the next year, 3 more grand jury sessions would be held in an attempt to return indictments, but none were delivered. By the end of 1966, the case had pretty much disappeared from the media and life was moving on. Dr. K. Wine was granted leave from the University of Kentucky in July of 1966. He sold his house and said he was moving his family to New York to take a new job. Dr. Emma took off too and studied in Switzerland for a spell before coming back to Lexington, the medical center, that is, to step right back into her old position. Now, if she was involved in the murder, her plan to get Dr. Madison, get him back didn't work, did it? As far as anybody knows, they never spoke to each other or saw each other again. Of course, nobody knew they was speaking and seeing each other to start with, did they? Except Mary Mars. Now, while Dr. Madison was in New York, he met and married his second wife, Joan. He would go on to get a job with Dow Pharmaceuticals. Now, he finally died of cancer in July of 1985. So the mystery of who killed Mary Mars K. Wine, it remains right where it is, and I guess where it was back in 1965. It's one of Kentucky's biggest mysteries, despite hundreds of hours of investigation. Nearly all the detectives that worked the case thought they were just one puzzle piece away from solving it. That little puzzle piece is still tucked away somewhere, and I guess by now probably going to stay there. Folks, I hope you got something out of our story today. If you did, please rate and review the podcast, and don't forget to subscribe and follow, whether you're listening on or watching on Spotify, YouTube, or Rumble. Please like and share the show around, or use any segment of video or sound you'd like. All I ask is that you mention that it comes from Appalachian Murder, Mystery, and Legend Podcast. Come on over to Appalachian Murder, Mystery, and Legend Podcast on Facebook, where we talk everything Appalachian or about anything else you want to bring up. Now, I'll be back real soon with another Appalachian Murder, Mystery, or Legend, and I will see you then.